And now we're going to move to Oliver Boyd-Barrett, Professor Oliver Boyd-Barrett, who is a colleague and pleased to call him a friend as well. Oliver is emeritus professor at Bowling Green State University, extremely well known in the field of communications and media studies, a long history studying power, communications, and in recent years, really sort of poking some of the bigger propaganda drives there have been, both in relation to Syria, Russiagate, and so on. And so it's with great pleasure I hand over now to Oliver. Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you, Piers. Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you to OPS, Propaganda in Focus, UK Column, for this opportunity. I would also like to say what an honor it is to be sharing this platform with you, Piers, and with David, who have been such undeserving targets of very aggressive state-backed attempts to suppress unwelcome, unpopular ideas. So with that background, what I want to do is to situate our symposium in a broader context, this context of state intervention in, state attempts to control the production in society of knowledge and ideas, principally in the domains of journalism, academia, entertainment, and faith or belief or religious systems. And I'll quickly note in passing how agencies of state intervention and control over the production of ideas and knowledge in society, the agencies that the state uses are themselves often knowledge-based organizations or institutions, including, for example, so-called non-government organizations, many of which are, of course, government subsidized. We saw so much of that in Syria, or public relations agencies, a very celebrated case being the babies being thrown out of incubators disinformation campaign spearheaded by Hill and Knowlton PR agency back in the time of the 1991 Gulf War. Within the sociology of media studies, which I represent, among other relevant disciplines, we are beginning by now, after 2 or 3 decades, particularly over the last 2 to 3 decades, we're beginning to accumulate astonishing in-depth evidence of just how the state does penetrate each and all of these domains. As Marx classically argued, the rules that prevail in any society are the ideas that prevail in any society are the ideas of the ruling classes, and we can add to that the ruling classes work very hard to make sure that their ideas do in fact prevail. They don't wipe out alternative ideas totally, but they do increase the price that has to be paid by those who want to combat those ideas. This is the phenomenon of the spiral of silence, where people perceive the ideas of the ruling class to be dominant and prevailing, and they are less inclined, therefore, to risk their necks and to say or to speak out in defiance of the ideas of the ruling classes. I'm going to cite 2 or 3 instances, I think fairly outrageous instances of state control of knowledge production, of ideas production in society, noting to start with how we now know, in a way that we didn't know 10, 20 years ago, the extent to which movies, entertainment television productions, have themselves been compromised and corrupted through collusion between producers and the intelligence agencies and the agencies of the security state. For the purposes of revisionist history, for the purposes of making security agencies look good, for the purposes of driving recruitment into these agencies. We have an extraordinary history talking about faith and belief systems. We have an extraordinary history, which is still ongoing in many parts of the world, of the Western intelligence manipulation of extremist religious movements, including Salafist, I would say fanatical Islamist extremist groups, as we saw again in Syria, as we've seen for the past 100 years throughout the Middle East, perhaps starting with British collaboration with the Muslim Brotherhood, narratives of that kind, to which, by the way, US academics added their own flavor by advising the US government how to rewrite Islamic textbooks in the period when the United States was trying to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. We kind of created a new version of extremist Islam for the weaponizing it, in other words, weaponizing the religion, weaponizing the religion's devotees for political purposes. We've also seen how the field of social sciences in general has been compromised, has been corrupted, not least by the efforts that social anthropology has made to identify the fissures, the points of fragmentation, the points of possible dissidence within society, either deliberately in aid of, or at least being easily exploitable by intelligence agencies, military agencies, looking for the weak points of given societies which are the targets of regime change shenanigans. So this is an enterprise in which nearly all nation states invest very considerable energy and resources. We can call it soft power. And although it is expensive, I mean, there's very big money involved in this game, it is nowhere near as expensive nor as counterproductive as the use of brute force. Unchecked, these tendencies towards state control or intervention in the production of ideas and knowledge in society, unchecked, these tendencies lead nearly always towards totalitarianism. We began to see this, the possibility, the potential of this in the West with the CIA initiative in the 1950s of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, whose purpose was to combat left-wing tendencies in the worlds of politics, unions, universities, academe, intellectuals, journalists, filmmakers, poets, and the arts. Totalitarian, you see. By co-opting individuals and groups into ideological bubbles that sort of still seemed relevant and sexy, but were a great deal safer for the establishment, for the US and Western pro-capitalist establishments. A spin-off of this period were the investigations in the 1970s permitted by the disgrace for the United States of the failure to win the war in Vietnam. We had a number of investigations, the Church and the Pike congressional investigations into the operations of the CIA. Added to that was the Rockefeller Commission slightly later on in the 1970s. And they unearthed not only the evidence that, if anyone remembers these at all, they're going to remember the evidence of 400 CIA assets within domestic United States media, including sometimes publishers of very important mainstream media. And this is not to talk about what I'm sure were the thousands of other journalistic assets that were exploited throughout the world. And since the 1970s, we've got continuing evidence, although not quite so helpfully produced by the state itself, evidence of the compromising of our media systems by the operations of intelligence agencies. I mean, I'll just mention a couple quickly in passing that are more recent in relevance, namely the practice of intelligence agency vetting of employees by the BBC. For many decades, supposedly now in the past, but who really knows? And the continuation of what we used to call the D-Notice system in Great Britain, whereby essentially the editors and publishers of mainstream media collaborate with the intelligence establishment to suppress news that information, I should say, that is potentially embarrassing or compromising for the state. And we know it doesn't really take very much investigation to come to the conclusion that there has to be very effective, very deeply penetrating compromising of mainstream media. When you think of such recent instances, for example, of the refusal of Western mainstream media throughout almost the entire West to pick up on the Seymour Hersh story of how the United States sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines about a year ago. I mean, who could possibly have been surprised by that by that charge, given that President Joe Biden and his State Department lackey Victoria Nuland, or is it the other way around? Maybe Biden is Nuland's lackey. They actually said that they were going to destroy Nord Stream in the event that Russia should launch its special military operation. The entire Western mainstream media establishment couldn't even dare to pick up on that Seymour Hersh story. Total silence for many weeks, really going up until the present time. A similar kind of extraordinary silence when it was disclosed to a Senate Intelligence Committee that the head of the tiny little company that had been employed by the Democratic Party of the United States, I'm talking about CrowdStrike, had been employed to investigate what the Democratic Party suspected might have been Russian intelligence agency hacking of DNC computers. All this at the time when it had been disclosed that Hillary Clinton had actually been actively supported by the Democratic Party national campaign, which should have been, of course, neutral between her and Bernie Sanders. No, there's the story that CrowdStrike, in admission, in response to a question from a Senate Intelligence Committee, that it had actually no evidence, no real hard evidence of the fact that that this hacking had occurred. Total silence for years, total silence by Western mainstream media of this extraordinary admission. After years and years and years of media hyperbole and hysteria over the false narrative of Russiagate, they couldn't even be bothered, wouldn't even dare to report a single admission within the context of a formal congressional investigation that the whole thing was a hoax. Okay, well, I don't have too much time, so I'm going to quickly jump a little bit, and I'm going to talk about academia in particular. So what are the main ways in which the world of academia is compromised and corrupted by the efforts of the state to suppress and to direct the production of ideas. I say direct. I mean, I think of my experience, many years teaching in the United Kingdom, of how wave after wave of revisionist ideas came to us from prestigious centers of learning in the United Kingdom. Anytime it looked as though this realpolitik thinking and critique of the establishment came to be a little bit too widespread to be comfortable to the ruling classes. I think principally the mechanisms have to do with research funding. So we know, I referred a moment ago to the CIA Congress for Cultural Freedom. I've referred a moment ago to the Church and the Pike committees of the mid-1970s and their discoveries. Thereafter, the main thing that happened thereafter really was that this kind of totalitarian work by the CIA was farmed off to other agencies. So we had, for example, now we've got the National Endowment for Democracy, whose real title should be the State Department Agency for Non-Democratic Regime Changes in any country that we actually don't like. U.S. aid and then the research foundations, like there's a lot of evidence particularly from the early years, very, very close collaboration between the CIA and the Ford Foundation. Academics need to do research. In order to do research, they very frequently need research funding. Most of that funding comes from large agencies. They have their own agendas. They will approve certain topics and disapprove most. And academics have to fit themselves into the molds that are prescribed by the research foundations. If they're going to get any money, and if they're going to be able to generate, therefore, any research publications as a result of that money that they have received. And you can bet your bottom line that none of that is going to produce anything that could be remotely threatening to the safety and security of the ruling classes. Academics are bought off frequently by consultancy opportunities within the broad compass of the military-industrial complex. Again, they're forced into molds not of their own making by the prestigious publishing houses, the prestigious journals, whose leading editorial characters are promoted by processes of which we know very little at this moment, I have to confess, but which very rarely lead to appointments that are, again, remotely threatening to the interests of the ruling classes. Revisionist ideas, yes. Radical ideas, no. And then we got the very hierarchical structure of universities in most countries, perhaps, certainly in the Western countries, which basically they smother the dissidents. Intellectual dissidents are smothered down to lower prestige institutions, publishing in lower ranking journals, or publishing in lesser known publishing houses. Yes, we have a number of famous dissidents. In fact, their fame comes from the fact that there are just so few of them. There are people like Noam Chomsky at MIT, well, formerly MIT, of course. We currently have the interesting personalities of John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago vis-a-vis the Ukraine crisis, whose realpolitik seems to be critical of U.S. involvement in the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, but seems fairly comfortable with the notion of an inevitable final war of the United States with China. And then we got Jeffrey Sachs, who I have to confess, just even in recent weeks alone, he appears to have gotten more and more adventurous in his radical, passionate critique of the U.S. rulers so far as foreign policy is concerned. So we have these few exceptions, and in a way, while they are very helpful and very useful and very intelligent men, and I guess they are men, they also provide reassurance to those who might have doubted it, that the ruling classes are still in charge. And yeah, they can live with a few outstanding critics. We've got the university's own employment, promotion, and review practices that I think broadly, on the basis of my own experience here in the United States, work very conservatively. We have some very interesting examples of universities cultivating. They tend to be rather prestigious universities that cultivate special relationships with the security agencies, with the security services. I was particularly interested a year or so ago in a story by Alan MacLeod on London University's King's College Department of Journalism, and there's one other department too at King's College, where there appears to be this history, very special cultivation of courses for the security forces and the feeding of graduates into the security services, or the feeding of people who were once affiliated with the security services, or their cutouts like Bellingcat, feeding them into the world of mainstream journalism. And we got a sort of similar kind of operation, a similar kind of relationship, cozy relationship going on between Harvard University and its Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Now, I don't know whether that's still ongoing, but there was a history of critique of Harvard University's Center for Middle Eastern Studies in this context of special academic relationships with the security state. I got to go back to I have a couple of minutes. So the world of mainstream journalism is hooked. I'm going to read this out because I'm not going to remember the phraseology. The world of mainstream journalism is hooked up like an addict to his needle to the establishment's foreign policy goals. And this evident relationship is very poorly understood in the world of academia. I think that the greatest problem, actually, for me, that the academic community represents for the world is its credulity, its lack of understanding of how mainstream media work. Of course, for us in media studies, for some of us in media studies, I mean, it would be a gross mistake on our part to presume that all of our colleagues think the same way, because a great many of us don't. But those of us who actually have penetrated the long-standing cloaks of deceit and manipulation that surround the world of mainstream media, we should never underestimate the degree of credulity that our colleagues in other disciplines, in the natural sciences, in the physical sciences, in technology, the credulity which they continue to concede to the Western mainstream media, including, sadly, too often, even historians who somehow think that quoting newspaper texts from the 19th century is evidence of anything at all, other than for the fact that even more than they are now, Western mainstream media in those days were the children of the ruling classes and of the different factions within the ruling classes. So time after time after time, we just find this total credulity and innocence and culpable naivety of the academic establishment, of the academic community itself. At these times, for example, of outrageous regime change operations that we saw in Afghanistan following the invasion, on dubious pretext, by the way, in 2001, the invasion of Afghanistan, and then, of course, the even more outrageously pretexted invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the destruction, let's call it the willful destruction the sovereign state of Libya in 2010 by the West, the meddling about the misery that has been caused in Syria over the past 10 years through Western support of Salafist jihadist militia against Assad, the war against Yemen, and now, of course, as we've seen, the war against Ukraine. So I got those few seconds to complete this address and to express my deep thanks to my colleagues for making this event happen at all. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for that fascinating discussion. For somebody who went into academia sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, looking forward to, well, this is going to be a wonderful experience of open dialogue and learning and so on. Yep, everything that you described is something which I learned over the process of going through the system and so on. Did remind me early on, I wrote a book, an article with a colleague, Professor Eric Herring, taking Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model of the media, the positioning of the media in relation to corporations, reliance on official sources, flak, ideology, and so on, and saying, well, actually, all of these constraints which we identify in the media, as acting against their ability to critique and challenge governments, all of those filters or factors apply to academia as well. And that's certainly something which, when I wrote that back in 2002-3, I sort of, obviously I believed a lot of it, but I didn't realize quite how bad it was until I sort of moved further up the academic hierarchy and so on, and realized how powerful those constraints were. Thank you, Oliver.